Imagine being a Roman senator in 67 AD, summoned to Nero's golden house. The evening is unnervingly quiet, with the city's usual hum now distant, swallowed by the heavy, oppressive silence that weighs down on you. Each step you take echoes through the empty streets, the sound too loud, too sharp in the stillness. Your heart pounds in your chest, and sweat beads on your brow. The guards ahead stand motionless, their bronze armor glinting faintly under the torchlight, their faces impassive, unreadable. There's no warmth in their eyes, no hint of welcome. Only a cold, clinical detachment. As you approach, the massive wooden doors of the golden house creak open, revealing the opulent interior bathed in golden light. The walls are lined with rich tapestries, the air thick with the scent of burning incense, but beneath the beauty of the palace, there's something unnatural, something sinister lurking in the shadows. You feel it. Something in the atmosphere that makes your skin crawl, a subtle undercurrent of fear that prickles down your spine. The air grows heavier with each step you take, as though the palace itself is breathing, waiting. The flicker of torches casts long shadows that stretch and writhe, contorting into grotesque shapes. You hear laughter, soft, hollow, unnerving, echoing from the distance. The kind of laughter that doesn't reach the eyes. Your footsteps quicken, heart hammering against your ribs, but no matter how fast you move, the path seems to stretch on, winding deeper into the heart of this palace that feels more like a tomb. A door opens before you, revealing Nero himself, seated upon his golden throne. His eyes gleam with an unsettling hunger, the smile on his face unnaturally wide, his gaze unblinking. There's a palpable tension in the room, a sickening sense of something monstrous lurking just beneath the surface. His gaze locks with yours, cold, calculating. You realize then, with a sinking dread, that this is not a dinner for diplomacy. It's a dinner for spectators. And you are the prey. This is not a place of power, but a theater of horror, where the line between life and death fades away. You have walked into a world where nothing, not even your own soul, is safe. Every second here is a calculated move, a game of psychological terror that no one ever leaves unchanged. And if you think you are safe, if you think that you are here simply by chance, you are gravely mistaken. The Golden House is not just a palace. It is a crucible. And you, like all who enter, will be tested in ways you cannot yet comprehend. The chambers of the Golden House seem to close in around you, the silence pressing down like the weight of centuries. Yet, as your eyes adjust to the shadowy flicker of torchlight, your mind cannot help but drift back, to a time long before this moment of terror, when Nero's name was not yet cursed, when the emperor's reign had been full of hope. At first, there was promise in his rise. In 54 AD, Nero ascended to the throne at the tender age of 16, the youngest ever to wear the imperial crown. His early reign was met with applause. The people cheered, the Senate approved. It seemed that Rome had found its ruler, a fresh face, one whose youth held the potential for change. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, a woman of cunning and political ambition, had engineered his rise. She saw her son as the future of Rome, the fulfillment of her own aspirations. In the beginning, Nero was not the monster that would become legend. He initiated policies that favored the common people, lowering taxes, providing grain to the masses, and sponsoring public games. The Senate, once wary of his ascendancy, even found themselves cautiously optimistic, watching as Nero seemed to embody the values of Roman virtue. His reign was supposed to be one of renewal, a time to bring stability to the empire after the troubled rule of Claudius, his adopted father. But there is a subtle, inevitable shift, a sickness that often accompanies the throne. Beneath the veneer of youthful exuberance, the heart of a ruler was hardening, and the very traits that made him a promising leader were the ones that would turn his soul dark. Nero's early relationship with his mother was a complex one. Agrippina, who had placed him on the throne, quickly became the very figure who sought to control him. She was a mother who loved power more than her son. And as Nero grew older, the relationship between them turned toxic, a tightrope walk of manipulation, betrayal, and incestuous ambition. It wasn't long before Nero, desperate for independence and for the freedom to rule without the strings of his mother's influence, turned against her. In 59 AD, he had Agrippina killed in one of the most chillingly calculated executions of the era. It was an act of liberation for him, a violent severing of the ties that bound him to his past. The method was as symbolic as it was brutal, an attempted shipwreck that turned into a cold-blooded murder. Agrippina's death was disguised as an accident, but the empire knew the truth. The emperor had not only killed his mother, but had erased the very woman who had shaped his destiny. From that moment on, Nero's reign would be marred by a descent into madness. But it wasn't until the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD that his transformation was complete. The fire began on a hot July night, spreading through the city with terrifying speed. It consumed temples, homes, and palaces, ravaging Rome in a way that had never been seen before. Thousands of people were displaced, their livelihoods reduced to ash. It was a tragedy that tore at the heart of the empire. Yet, amidst the chaos, Nero's reaction was not one of a ruler rallying to the cause, but rather a man looking for an opportunity to expand his empire, to rewrite the city to fit his own vision. While Rome burned, Nero retreated to his personal palace and played his lyre. He was said to have sung of the fall of Troy, but there was no empathy in his music, only the music of a man whose empire had turned to ruins, and whose heart had long since crumbled to dust. The public, desperate for leadership, looked to him, and yet Nero's focus remained on the Golden House, a monstrous, opulent palace that would become the physical manifestation of his growing insanity. In the aftermath of the fire, Nero took the opportunity to shift blame. He accused the Christians, a small, persecuted sect of Rome, of starting the flames. Their persecution escalated, turning into horrific spectacles of human suffering. Nero, already corrupted by the power of the throne, found in the fire the perfect excuse to unleash the sadistic impulses that had been brewing beneath his regal surface. His desire for control, for vengeance, became unrelenting. The fire had broken something in him, something irrevocable. Where once he had been a promising ruler, now he was a tyrant. The blood of Rome's own citizens now stained his hands. The years following the fire saw Nero dive deeper into depravity. What began as isolated acts of cruelty grew into full-blown systematic terror. It was no longer enough to execute his enemies. Now, Nero needed to twist their deaths into performances, turning torture into a spectacle for the entertainment of the masses. He transformed public executions into theatrical plays, where victims weren't simply killed. They were forced to embody mythological roles, to play characters in stories that would end in their real deaths. He turned his palace into a living nightmare, a place where the boundaries between art, power, and sadism blurred into something grotesque. The people who entered Nero's orbit soon realized that the throne did not just rule over an empire, it consumed its subjects, body and soul. If you're still curious about the path this emperor took to ruin, subscribe now. Or don't. But don't come crying in the comments later when you realize you missed the start of one of history's most twisted stories. There is no gentle way to describe what follows. The public spectacles under Nero's rule were not mere executions. They were grotesque theatrical performances, carefully staged for the enjoyment of the emperor and the Roman people. Every death, every cry for mercy, was scripted. And in these spectacles, death was not the end. It was merely the beginning of an agonizing performance designed to entertain. The Colosseum, the grand arena of Rome, became the backdrop for Nero's darkest fantasies. The air inside was thick with the stench of blood and sweat, the sounds of clashing swords and screams blending into a symphony of terror. The audience, hungry for something far darker than mere spectacle, watched eagerly as victims were led into the arena, not as criminals, but as actors in the emperor's twisted play. Imagine, if you will, a man condemned to die. He is dressed as Icarus, his wax wings bound tightly to his arms. He is raised to a great height, and before he can grasp the gravity of what is happening, he is pushed off the edge. The audience watches, silent at first, as he plummets to the ground, his body crumpling upon impact. His death is not quick. The audience watches in silence as his final moments play out. It is not just his death they are witnessing, but a myth reborn in the most horrific way. And Nero watches, the slightest curl of a smile on his lips, as if enjoying a piece of art, a piece of suffering crafted by his hand. But the mythological reenactments didn't stop there. Women, accused of adultery or other crimes, were tied to the horns of wild bulls and dragged across the arena. The bulls charged, the women screamed, and the audience cheered. It wasn't just about the physical agony, it was about the humiliation, the degradation. Nero didn't just want the victims to die, he wanted them to be broken in front of thousands, to be stripped of their dignity before the end came. And then there were the criminals, the ones who had crossed Nero in some way. They were not simply sentenced to death, they were turned into actors for Nero's grotesque theater. Each condemned soul became a piece in his monstrous puzzle. A man accused of theft was forced to play the role of Icarus, only to fall to his death in front of an eager crowd. The line between myth and reality blurred, and in that blurring, Nero found a twisted form of control. The spectators were not just watching, they were complicit. They were actively participating in the destruction of these lives, and in doing so, they were conditioned, desensitized to the cruelty unfolding before their eyes. It wasn't just the victims who were broken. The audience, too, was being reshaped. These public executions were more than just acts of punishment. They were a form of psychological manipulation, turning an entire society into spectators of pain. Watching death and suffering became a public pastime, a form of entertainment that the people of Rome had no choice but to accept. But it wasn't just about watching death unfold. It was about the subtle, creeping realization that any one of them could be next. Any one of them could find themselves forced to play a role in Nero's sick theater. And once that idea took root, fear became the most effective weapon of all. Still not subscribed? Go ahead, skip it. But when you read about the next level of torture and regret not subscribing, don't say I didn't warn you. The cruelty Nero exhibited in public was just the tip of the iceberg. Behind the walls of the Golden House, in the dark, hidden chambers, he unleashed horrors that no one outside his inner circle would ever witness, until now. These were not just executions or tortures, these were calculated, methodical experiments in suffering. Nero didn't just want his enemies to die, he wanted to break them, to tear apart their minds and their spirits before they met their end. One of the most chilling cases was that of Senator Marcus Flavius, a man whose only crime was to question Nero's artistic abilities. A senator, once respected, now found himself dragged into the emperor's web. The punishment was swift, but it wasn't the typical execution. Nero had other plans for Flavius. The senator was arrested in the dead of night, pulled from his home, and dragged to the Golden House. What happened next was unlike anything the Roman Empire had ever seen. Flavius was kept alive for months, subjected to a series of tortures designed not just to break his body, but to destroy his very will to live. His bones were broken and reset, over and over, each time ensuring that they healed in ways that would cause permanent agony. His teeth were removed one by one, each procedure carefully timed, each wound treated to keep him conscious. The pain was unbearable, but Nero was not done yet. To add further insult to injury, Nero made Flavius write letters to his family, fabricating sexual acts and political betrayals. These letters, filled with lies, were delivered to his wife and children. Imagine, for a moment, the horror of knowing that as you suffer in unimaginable pain, your own family is being destroyed by your own words, words you never spoke, but were forced to write. The psychological toll was far worse than any physical wound. Nero, in his madness, had turned torture into an art form, using not just pain, but humiliation, deceit, and psychological manipulation as tools to break his enemies. This was no longer about power. This was about the creation of suffering, an endless loop where the victim could never escape, where every act of torment fed into the next. It wasn't just about the body. It was about the mind. The humiliation, the loss of identity, the complete destruction of the self. In Nero's world, nothing was sacred, not even the soul. His ability to twist the mind with such cruelty was what set him apart from any other tyrant in history. It was an insanity so deep that no one, not even his closest advisors, were safe from it. If you're still not subscribed, then go ahead, just sit there and wait for the next round of horrors. But when you're wondering why you didn't subscribe sooner, feel free to comment your regrets. The Golden House. The name itself evokes grandeur, but inside, it was anything but magnificent. Beneath its gilded surface, hidden in the shadows of its sprawling halls, lay a labyrinth of darkness. This was not the palace of an emperor, it was the domain of a madman, a place where the boundaries of cruelty and suffering were pushed to their limits, a place where pain was not just inflicted, but studied, perfected, and turned into an art. Deep in the bowels of Nero's palace, beyond the opulence and beauty, were chambers, rooms carefully concealed from the eyes of those who might question what truly transpired within the walls of the Golden House. These chambers were filled with instruments of agony, tools designed not for quick death but for prolonged suffering. There were racks, metal devices that twisted and contorted the human body in ways that defied nature, and heated implements that seared flesh with precision. But these weren't just for executions. No, they were for something far more sinister. Experiments. Nero wasn't satisfied with mere pain, he sought to understand it, to control it, to turn the endurance of human suffering into something that could be replicated, measured, and perfected. Medical tools littered the floors, not of a doctor's office, but of a torture chamber. Drawings, anatomical sketches, meticulous and chilling in their detail, lined the walls, drawn by Nero himself. These were no ordinary diagrams, they were plans, blueprints for furthering his grotesque knowledge of the human body, of how much pain it could endure before it broke, before the mind could no longer function under the strain. These were the tools of a man who had abandoned the concept of mercy, who had crossed the threshold where death itself no longer held any mystery. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about an obsession with the control of human life through pain. The victims of Nero's sadistic experimentation were not random criminals, but often political enemies, those who dared to question him, or even those who simply caught his attention for the wrong reasons. They were subjected to prolonged tortures, their bodies twisted and reshaped, their minds slowly unraveling under the constant strain. Nero didn't just use his power to execute or punish. He used it to explore the limits of human suffering, how much a body could endure before it shattered, how long a soul could stay intact before it was destroyed. These weren't just tortures for the sake of punishment. They were tests, each one meticulously crafted to push the boundaries of human endurance. For Nero, the Golden House wasn't just a palace, it was a laboratory. Every victim was a specimen, each cry of pain a piece of data to be analyzed. The more he experimented, the more his obsession grew. And in the dark chambers beneath the Golden House, this obsession found its darkest expression. You've made it this far, but are you ready for more? Subscribe now, or leave a comment about why you're avoiding the rest of this nightmare. The truth is here if you dare to face it. No tale of Nero's depravity is more tragic, or more chilling, than the story of Sporus, a young freedman who became the ultimate victim of the emperor's twisted desires. Sporus was a young man, scarcely more than a boy, whose life would be forever destroyed not by the physical torture Nero was so infamous for, but by a far deeper, more sinister cruelty, the destruction of his very identity. It began with a simple fact: Sporus bore a striking resemblance to Nero's deceased wife, Poppaea Sabina. To Nero, this resemblance was more than a passing curiosity, it was an obsession, a maddening fixation that twisted his mind into dark, incomprehensible forms. His grief over the loss of his wife, the woman he loved, was not the grief of a normal man, but that of a tyrant whose power was threatened by the finality of death. So, Nero decided to recreate Poppaea, to bring her back, not in spirit, but in flesh. The process was as grotesque as it was unthinkable. Sporus, a young and innocent man, was castrated by Nero's personal physicians. His body, once his own, was transformed into something it was never meant to be. The medical procedure was brutal, an assault on the very essence of his being, performed not out of necessity, but out of the emperor's twisted desire to turn Sporus into a living replacement for his wife. But it did not end there. Nero went further. He had Sporus dressed in the garments of a woman, forced him to take the role of his deceased wife in a mock wedding ceremony that would be attended by the imperial court. It was a performance. A cruel charade in which Sporus was forced to live as someone else, to wear the skin of another, to become a puppet in Nero's delusional fantasy. The psychological devastation was immeasurable. Imagine, for a moment, the terror of losing yourself entirely, of being stripped of your identity and remade into something you never were. This wasn't about sexual gratification. This was about control, about the complete and utter destruction of another human being's sense of self. Nero didn't want a wife. He wanted to create a living, breathing doll, one who would never speak or act on their own accord, but only perform the role that Nero had assigned to them. Sporus was no longer a person. He was a thing, a plaything for an emperor whose cruelty knew no bounds. Every day for 2 years, Sporus was forced to live this nightmare. He was expected to speak as Poppaea, to remember things that weren't his memories, to act as someone he could never be. Sporus became a prisoner in his own body, a shell of a person who had no will, no voice, no choice. The trauma of this psychological warfare went deeper than any wound, and it is said that, in the end, Sporus had no identity left at all. He was nothing but a puppet, his soul crushed by the hands of Nero. And when it was all over, when Nero grew tired of his living replacement, Sporus was discarded, left to suffer in ways no one will ever fully understand. Nero's reign was filled with physical horrors, yes. But Sporus's story reveals the darkest part of Nero's cruelty, his ability to destroy a person's soul, to erase their very identity and leave them a hollow shell. If you're still hesitant to subscribe, I get it. But know this, you're one click away from knowing how deep Nero's depravity really ran. Subscribe now, or keep your silence in the comments. Rome, the mighty empire, had once bowed at the feet of Nero. His name echoed in the halls of power, his voice a command that rang through the Senate, his whims shaping the very foundation of the empire. But as the years wore on, something began to shift, a subtle undercurrent of discontent that rippled through the streets and the courts, growing stronger, more dangerous. The cracks in Nero's rule were beginning to show, and the weight of his cruelty was starting to break the empire that had once supported him. The first signs of rebellion came from within the ranks of his own military, men who had once fought for his glory, now turning against him. The legions, those who had helped elevate Nero to his throne, began to question his leadership. They were weary of his madness, his unpredictable commands, his increasingly erratic behavior. His extravagant spending on his personal palace, the Golden House, had drained the treasury. His endless indulgences and theatrical obsessions had drained the goodwill of the people, and even the Senate had begun to whisper. The soldiers who once fought and bled for Nero now saw him as a tyrant, a liability. The blood of Rome no longer flowed to serve his whims, it had turned, pooling around him like a dark, festering stain. Generals, once loyal to Nero, began to rise up. Vindex, a governor in Gaul, declared rebellion against the emperor. Soon, Galba, a respected military leader, followed, and the flames of revolt spread across the empire. Nero, once invincible, was now surrounded by enemies, both within and without. His grip on power, once so certain, now slipped through his fingers like sand. The very empire that he had molded in his image now rejected him, and his dream of an empire built on personal glory crumbled before his eyes. In his desperation, Nero turned to what he knew best, he ran. Not a leader, not a ruler, but a coward. His palace, his precious golden house, no longer offered him protection. The streets, once filled with his adoring citizens, now whispered of his downfall. Nero fled from the city, hoping to escape the wrath of those who had once served him. He sought refuge, but found none. His own soldiers turned on him, declaring their loyalty to Galba, the man who would replace him. Nero, the emperor who had controlled the fate of millions, was now a fugitive, a shadow of the power he once held. The end came swiftly and quietly. Nero, stripped of all dignity, unable to face the consequences of his actions, turned to the one escape left to him, death. He begged his servants to help him, to save him from the inevitable. But they refused. Alone, with only the weight of his own madness bearing down on him, Nero took his own life, ending the reign of a man who had once held the empire in the palm of his hand. It was a coward's death, a final, pathetic end to a reign built on cruelty and terror. The emperor who had once reveled in his own power, who had tortured, manipulated, and destroyed with impunity, now lay dead, his empire crumbling around him. The golden age of Nero had turned to dust, and with it, the soul of Rome. If you're still watching but haven't subscribed, what are you waiting for? A lesson in power gone wrong? Subscribe now, or leave a comment to explain why you didn't. As the dust settled, the true cost of Nero's reign became evident. His name, once sung with praise, now became synonymous with cruelty, madness, and the decay of a once great empire. But even in his fall, Nero left behind something more enduring than his name. He left a blueprint for tyranny, a map of how unchecked power, when left to fester, can consume everything in its path. Nero's reign wasn't just an isolated incident of madness. His cruelty, his manipulation, and his twisted sense of power became templates for future despots, rulers who would follow in his footsteps, from Caligula to Hitler. The methods Nero used to bend people to his will, psychological manipulation, fear, and terror, were refined over centuries, used by leaders who learned from his mistakes, his successes, his failures. His use of torture as an art form, his ability to break both the body and the spirit, influenced tyrants who would later shape the course of history. The legacy of Nero's rule is not just a story of one man's rise and fall. It is a warning. A warning of what happens when power becomes absolute, when cruelty is no longer seen as an anomaly but as a tool to control and manipulate. His reign shows us the dangers of unchecked authority, the corruption that festers in the absence of restraint. But the lessons of Nero are not just historical, they are timeless. The echoes of his rule can still be felt today, in the ways power can be abused, in the ways leaders can manipulate the masses, in the ways fear can be used to silence dissent. Nero's story isn't just the story of an empire that fell, it is the story of human nature itself, the dark side that we must always guard against. You've learned the depths of Nero's reign. But are you going to just move on, or will you subscribe to Grim Histories for more stories that shape our world? Or, if you feel rebellious, leave a comment and tell us why you haven't hit that subscribe button yet.